He slammed the folder onto the table so hard the coffee cups rattled and fell, and when Alicia Romano looked up from her sketchbook, she saw her father's hands shaking. The man across from him, thick-necked, gold-ringed with eyes that had never learned mercy, leaned forward and said it slowly like he enjoyed the sound of each word. "You have 72 hours, old man. After that, we don't come for the money. We come for the girl." Her father said nothing. He just sat there, his mouth open, his face the color of old ash. And the man laughed as he walked out. Just laughed. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel, follow every part of this story until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Alicia Romano had always believed that if you kept your world small enough, nothing terrible could find you. She kept her apartment tidy. She kept her grades high. She kept her friendships close and selective, and she kept her heart even closer guarded. Not out of coldness, but out of a particular kind of wisdom that comes from watching the people you love make catastrophic mistakes. Her father had been making them her entire life. She had learned early that love without discipline was just another word for disaster. At 23, she was doing what she had always done, managing. She had 2 part-time jobs, a scholarship, and a thesis on early Renaissance portraiture that her professor called the most focused work he had seen from an undergraduate in 11 years. She was proud of that. She had earned every inch of it. What she had not earned, what she had never asked for, never consented to, never even seen coming, was the phone call she received on a Tuesday night in October when the rain was coming down hard and she was sitting cross-legged on her bed with a highlighter behind her ear and a mug of chamomile going cold on her nightstand. The number was her father's. She almost didn't pick up. "Alicia." His voice was wrong from the first syllable. Too thin, too careful. "Papa, what happened?" It wasn't a question. She had learned a long time ago that with Enzo Romano, you didn't ask questions that gave him room to construct a story. You stated it flat and you waited, and eventually the truth fell out because he was too tired or too scared to hold it up any longer. There was a long pause. She heard him breathing. She heard something else behind it, movement, a door, the muffled sound of voices she didn't recognize. "I need you to come home," he said. "Tell me what happened first." "Alicia." "Papa." Her voice was quiet. That was always more effective than volume. "Tell me right now what you've done." Another pause. Then in a voice so small she almost missed it. "I borrowed money from people I shouldn't have borrowed from, and I couldn't pay it back. And now they're saying—" He stopped. She heard him swallow. "They came to the house tonight. 3 of them. They said they want everything back plus interest by Friday or they're going to—" "How much?" she said. "Alicia." "How much, Papa?" The number he gave her made the room tilt. She sat very still. She set her highlighter down on the open page of her textbook and looked at the number on the wall of her mind like it was a piece of graffiti that had appeared overnight on a building she had trusted. "That's not borrowing," she said. "That's ruin." "I know." He sounded like he was going to cry, and she felt something clench inside her. Not sympathy, not yet, because she had given sympathy too many times and watched it disappear into the same hole as the money. What she felt was something colder and more complicated. It was love tangled up with exhaustion and fury wrapped around grief, and underneath all of it, fear. Clean, electric, undeniable fear. "I'm coming," she said, and she hung up. She sat there for exactly 30 seconds. Then she got up, put on her coat, and drove through the rain to the house she had grown up, in the house she had left the moment she turned 18, the house that smelled like cigarettes and old furniture, and the particular sadness of a life that kept almost working. Her father was in the kitchen. He looked 10 years older than the last time she had seen him, which had been 4 months ago at her cousin's graduation. His shirt was untucked. There was a bruise along his jaw that he hadn't mentioned on the phone. "They hit you," she said. "It was a warning." "That's not a warning, Papa. A warning is words." She sat down across from him. "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Leave nothing out." He told her. It took a long time, and there were parts where he couldn't look at her and parts where she had to ask him to slow down because the names and the amounts and the timeline were overlapping in ways that made her head swim. The short version was this. 18 months ago, Enzo Romano had started gambling again. Not at the track, not at the casino, somewhere darker, somewhere. The games were run by men who didn't accept checks and didn't negotiate and had no interest in payment plans. He had won enough early on to feel dangerous. Then he had lost everything. And then he had done the worst thing a man in that position can do. He had borrowed to chase the losses and borrowed again and again until the number he owed was larger than anything he could ever realistically repay. The men who had come tonight were collectors for a man named Victor Falcone. That name landed differently than the others. Alicia had heard it before. Not from her father, from her best friend, Marco Torelli. Her oldest friend, the person who had sat next to her in first grade and stolen her crayons, and somehow never stopped being in her life, despite every reason the universe provided for their friendship to fall apart. Marco's family was not like her family. Marco's family was something else entirely. Something that nobody ever said out loud, but that everyone in their neighborhood understood the way you understood weather as a force of nature that you didn't name directly but planned around every day of your life. And Marco's brother was Dante Moretti. Even in her own mind, that name arrived differently. It arrived with weight. She pushed it aside. This was not the moment. "Okay," she said when her father had finished. "How long until Friday?" "3 days. And if you don't pay?" He looked at the table. That was an answer enough. She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there with her arms crossed, staring at nothing while the rain worked its way down the glass and her mind worked its way through the problem like she was turning a Rubik's Cube in the dark, feeling for edges, testing angles, finding nothing that moved. She didn't have the money. She didn't know anyone who had the money. Her mother's family was estranged. Her own savings were enough to cover books and rent for 3 months, nothing more. She had no assets. She had no leverage. She had one thing. She had Marco. She turned around. "I need to make a call," she said. Her father looked up. Something passed across his face, hope maybe, or its starving cousin. "Who are you calling?" "Someone who might be able to help." She kept her voice completely neutral. "Go to bed, Papa. Don't answer the door for anyone." He didn't argue. That told her more than anything else exactly how frightened he really was. She went outside. She stood on the front step under the narrow overhang where the rain couldn't reach her, and she pulled up Marco's name on her phone and she stared at it for a long time. Marco would help her if he could. She knew that without question. But Marco was not the one with power. Marco was the younger brother, warm and funny and loyal and completely overshadowed by the man who ran the family's affairs with the kind of quiet authority that didn't require volume to be felt. She had met Dante Moretti exactly 9 times in her life. She had counted. She remembered each one the way you remember things that mark you, not because they were dramatic, but because something in you recognized on a cellular level that this person is not ordinary and you should pay attention. The first time she was 16 and she had gone to the Torelli house after school to do homework with Marco, and Dante had walked through the kitchen in a suit jacket with his sleeves rolled up, and he had looked at her. Just looked for maybe 3 seconds and said, "You must be the one Marco never shuts up about," and then walked out. She had not been able to concentrate on her homework for the next 40 minutes. The last time she was 22 at a family dinner Marco had dragged her to, and Dante had sat at the head of the table and barely spoken, and she had been acutely, humiliatingly aware of exactly where he was in the room at every moment, the way you are aware of something very bright or very hot, not because you're looking at it, but because your body insists on knowing. She dialed Marco. He picked up on the second ring. "Allie, it's almost midnight." "I know." She paused, said it fast. "I need to talk to Dante." Silence, long enough that she could hear him processing. When Marco spoke again, his voice was different, more careful. "What happened?" "My father. He's in trouble. Real trouble. The kind that has a deadline and consequences. I can't fix this on my own, Marco. I don't have the resources. And I think..." She stopped, breathed. "I think Dante is the only person who can make this go away." Another silence. Then very quietly, "Allie, do you know what you're asking?" "Yes." "I don't think you do." "Marco." Her voice cracked slightly and she hated herself for it. "Please, I'm standing in the rain outside my father's house and I have 72 hours and no options. Please, just can you make it happen?" She heard him exhale. she heard him think. And then he said, "Come to the house tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. I'll have him there." She said thank you. She hung up. She stood in the rain for another minute before she remembered she was supposed to be under the overhang. She was soaked through when she went back inside. She didn't notice. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her childhood bed and stared at the ceiling and rehearsed what she was going to say. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, it occurred to her that she was about to walk voluntarily into something she had spent her whole adult life carefully walking around. And that the reason she was going to do it was not only her father. It was also, and she admitted this to herself only in the absolute dark, in the absolutely private theater of her own mind, it was also because part of her had always known that Dante Moretti was a door she would eventually have to open, and some reckless, deeply irrational piece of her was already standing on the threshold. She got up at 7, she showered, she dressed carefully, not like she was trying to impress anyone, just like she was someone who took herself seriously. Black trousers, a cream blouse, her coat. She looked in the mirror and told herself to keep it together, and then she drove to the Moretti estate on the north side of the city and rang the bell at 5 minutes to 9. Marco opened the door. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, concerned and apologetic. And something else, something almost like a warning. "He's in the study," Marco said. "I'll walk you. I know the way." "Allie," he caught her arm gently. "Whatever happens in there, whatever he says, whatever he offers, you don't have to agree to anything. You know that, right?" She looked at him. She appreciated it. She also understood that they both knew she was running out of choices, and that the thing you don't have to do and the thing you are going to do are sometimes the same thing arriving from different directions. "I know," she said, and she walked down the hall. The study door was open. She knocked anyway. "Come in." His voice was the same as she remembered. Not loud, not performative, just present. The kind of voice that expected to be listened to because it had never had cause to repeat itself. Dante Moretti was standing at the window with his back to her when she entered. He turned around slowly, and she was struck, as she always was, as she was every time, as she suspected she would always be, by the simple, almost unfair fact of how he looked. He was 34. He wore a dark shirt, no tie, like he had already been working for hours, and the formality of the morning was already behind him. His eyes were dark and direct, and they settled on her with a stillness that made her feel as always simultaneously seen and examined. "Alicia," he said, not a greeting, just an acknowledgement, like a door opening. "Dante," she kept her voice level, "thank you for seeing me. Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her, unhurried, and he looked at her for a moment before he said anything further. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. She kept it brief and factual. Names, numbers, timeline. She did not apologize for her father. She did not editorialize. She laid it out like evidence and let it speak for itself. When she finished, Dante was quiet. He had not moved. He had not reacted. He looked at her with those still dark eyes and said, "You know who Victor Falcone is?" "I know what he is," she said, "which is why I'm here. Victor Falcone is not a man who responds to requests. He's not a man who negotiates." Dante's voice was entirely calm. That calmness she was beginning to understand was not indifference. It was something more deliberate. "What makes you think I'd involve myself in your father's mistakes?" And there it was, the question she had anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. She had rehearsed several answers. She chose the honest one. "Because Marco is my best friend and I have nowhere else to go," she said. "Because you're the only person in this city who Victor Falcone would actually back down from. And She paused, held his gaze. "Because I'm not asking you to do it for free. I'm asking what it would take, and I'm prepared to hear the answer." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, a fraction, like the needle of a compass settling. "You're prepared to hear the answer," he repeated. "Yes." He studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward slightly, and what he said next was so unexpected that she had to replay it twice in her mind before she believed it. "I've had a problem," he said. "For the past 6 months, there have been conversations in certain circles among certain people about the leadership of this family, about my unmarried status, about whether I have the kind of stability that commands the respect required in my position." A pause. "It is a political inconvenience. one I have been disinclined to address through the obvious means, because the obvious means require trust, and trust requires time, and I don't have either in abundance at the moment. She stared at him. You want a fiancé, he said. Someone credible. Someone who comes from my world enough to be believable, but who isn't from it enough to be, he chose the word with care, entangled. The silence in the room was enormous. You want me, she said slowly, to pretend to be engaged to you. For 3 months, possibly 4. His tone made it sound like a business quarter, like he was proposing a fiscal arrangement. You would live here in this house. You would appear at the appropriate events. You would be seen with me, present with me, and you would conduct yourself convincingly. Another pause. In exchange, your father's debt to Falcone disappears. Tonight. Completely. Alicia looked at him. She felt the whole shape of it, what he was asking, what it meant, what it would cost her. Not in money, in something harder to quantify. And when the 3 months are over, she said, an amicable and entirely private end to an engagement that was for all purposes relevant to your future, a quiet and mutually respectful decision. He almost sounded like he had practiced this. You go back to your life, your thesis, your degree. Your father continues his with his debts erased and, ideally, a lesson learned about the company he keeps. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd, because she was sitting across from the one person who had occupied the exact corner of her imagination she was most ashamed of, and he was offering to make her his fake fiancé, and her father's life was on the line, and she was 23 years old and completely unprepared for any of this. I need to think about it, she said. You have until tomorrow morning. She stood. He stood. They looked at each other across the desk, and she was struck by the sudden, vertiginous sensation that this was the last moment before something irrevocable, that whatever she said tomorrow would close one door and open another, and she had no way of knowing what was behind it. Dante, she said, and his name in her mouth felt strange and weighted like a word she had said privately 1,000 times and never aloud. If I agree, this is a transaction. Nothing more. He held her gaze. I understand. And my father doesn't know. He thinks it's real, or he thinks it's none of his business. But he doesn't know it was bought. A long pause, then, agreed, she nodded once. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door, and she was almost through it when his voice came behind her, quiet and without inflection. Alicia, she turned. Victor Falcone is not a patient man, Dante said. I would factor that into your timeline. She looked at him, she nodded again, and she walked out down the hall past Marco, who was waiting near the front door, with too much hope in his face, and out into the October morning, where the rain had stopped and the sky was the color of unfinished things. She sat in her hurricane for a long time. She told herself she was thinking, that she was being rational, that she was weighing options and calculating risk and being the careful, sensible person she had always been. But the truth, the thing she would not say, the thing that lived in the part of her mind where she kept all the things she was not ready to be honest about, and the truth was that she had already decided the moment she walked through his door. She just needed the night to catch up to the part of her that already knew. The next morning, she drove back to the estate. Marco opened the door again. He looked at her face and said nothing, and she walked past him down the hall to the study. The door was open. She knocked. Come in. She went in. She stood across from him. She looked at him without flinching. Okay, she said, I'll do it. And Dante Moretti looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and he said, good. Just that. Just good. Like he had expected nothing less. Like he had never doubted it for a moment. She would think about that later, the certainty in his face, the complete absence of surprise, and she would wonder what it meant. Whether it was arrogance, whether it was simply the habit of a man who rarely heard no, or whether he had known something about her even then that she hadn't quite caught up to yet. She moved in on a Thursday. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself that every time she looked at the overnight bag sitting by the door of her apartment, every time she opened a drawer and thought about what to pack, every time she looked around the small, tidy space she had built for herself and felt the particular ache of someone leaving something they worked hard for. 3 months, maybe 4. She had handled harder things. She had survived her father's disappointments, Her mother's absence, 4 years of academic pressure on a scholarship that didn't forgive mistakes. She could survive this. What she had not accounted for was the house itself. Not the way it looked. She had been there, enough times visiting Marco to know it was large and well-appointed and carried the particular atmosphere of a place where serious things happen behind closed doors. What she had not accounted for was what it felt like to arrive as a resident, to have a man she barely knew show her to a room that was larger than her entire apartment and tell her in a voice that managed to be both courteous and completely impersonal that dinner was at 7 and that she would meet with him tomorrow morning to discuss the schedule of appearances for the next month. The schedule of appearances, she repeated. Events, dinners, a charity function next weekend. Dante was already moving toward the door. Marco can show you the rest of the house if you want the tour. Dante. He stopped, turned. She kept her voice completely steady. Are we going to talk about what this actually looks like? Because I've agreed to a thing, but I don't know. I don't know how we act around each other. I don't know what people are supposed to see. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that might have been not quite surprise, but the cousin of it. Like he was accustomed to people waiting for him to set the terms, and she had just walked in ahead of schedule. We act, he said, like two people who chose each other. That means you don't flinch when I'm close to you. It means you look at me like you trust me, at least in public. It means that when someone asks how we met, you say through Marco, which is true, and that the rest happened the way these things happen. He paused. Naturally. Naturally, she said. Is that a problem? She thought about flinching, about what it would take to not flinch when he was close. No, she said. I just wanted us to be clear. We're clear. He left. She stood in the middle of the room and breathed slowly through her nose and told herself that this was fine. This was a transaction. She had agreed to the terms and she was going to execute them like a professional, and in 3 months she was going to walk out of this house and finish her thesis and never think about any of it again. She almost believed herself. Dinner that first night was the three of them, Alicia, Dante, and Marco. And it was Marco who saved it from becoming an endurance exercise. He talked enough for all of them, working through stories about people she knew and things that had happened and observations about the world that were funny enough to make her actually laugh twice. And the second time she laughed, she looked up and found Dante watching her from across the table with an expression she couldn't catalog. Not warm exactly, not cold either, something in between, attentive, like someone who was adding information to an ongoing calculation. She looked away first. After dinner, Marco pulled her aside in the hallway. You doing okay? I'm fine. You don't have to be fine. This is a lot. Marco, she looked at him. It's fine. Tell me about this charity thing next weekend. What kind of event is it? He hesitated. A gala, black tie. There'll be a lot of people there. People from Dante's world. Meaning what kind of people? Meaning people who will be watching you very carefully and forming opinions that matter. He said it gently but didn't soften it. They need to believe it, Allie. That's the whole point. And some of them are going to test it. She nodded slowly. Good thing I've been pretending to be fine my whole life, she said. I'm excellent at it. Marco looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his face that looked almost like guilt, and she wanted to ask him about it, but the moment passed and he changed the subject and she let it go. She went to bed early. She lay awake for a long time. The next morning, Dante was already at the desk in the study when she came in at 9. He had a coffee. He did not look up immediately when she entered. He finished what he was reading, set it aside, and then gave her his full attention in the way that she was already beginning to recognize as characteristic, total sudden, like a light being switched on. Sit down, he said. Good morning to you too, she said. He looked at her, the faintest shift, something that was not quite amusement. Good morning, Alicia. Better. She sat. He slid a folder across the desk. She opened it. Inside was a printed document, events listed by date, dress code, specified expected duration, brief notes on key attendees. It was extraordinarily organized. She found herself slightly impressed, despite herself. This weekend's gala is the most important, he said. It's the first time you'll be introduced publicly. The story is that we have been together quietly for several months. Marco introduced us. You're completing your degree. We kept it private because I don't conduct my personal life in public. Is that true about keeping things private? Yes. She looked at the folder. There's no mention here of how you're supposed to act around me either. That's not something I need written down. She looked up. He was watching her with that same quiet steadiness. She said, and what does that mean exactly? It means I know how to be convincing. She held his gaze. So do I. I just want us to be on the same page about where the lines are. If you put your arm around me at this gala, I need to know that's coming so I don't react wrong. Something passed through his eyes, too fast to catch. I'll try to give you notice, he said. Try, she said. Within reason, he said. And then unexpectedly, you are more direct than I expected. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment. Is that a problem? No, he picked up his pen. It's efficient. She almost laughed at that, almost. She looked back at the folder instead, and they spent the next 40 minutes going through the logistics of her new life, and she kept her voice professional and her expression neutral. And the whole time she was acutely uselessly aware that they were sitting approximately 3 feet apart, and that he smelled faintly of coffee and something else, something clean and understated, and that she was going to need to get a great deal better at ignoring that if this was going to work. The gala arrived before she was ready. She had expected to feel like an imposter. What she had not expected was to feel like this specific kind of imposter, the kind who is wearing a dress that fits too well, in heels she can actually walk in, and who has spent 40 minutes in front of a mirror, convincing herself that she belongs in a room she has never been in, and who then descends a staircase and finds Dante Moretti standing at the bottom, looking at her like he has just recalculated something. He said nothing. He offered his arm. She took it. In the car, he said, "You look like you belong here." "I don't." "That's not the point," he said. "The point is that everyone in that room will believe you do. Can you give me that?" She turned to look at him in the dim interior of the car. His profile was very still. She said, "What do you get nervous about?" He didn't answer right away. "Then what?" "Everyone has something. I'm nervous about tonight. What makes you nervous?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then in a voice that was slightly different from his usual one, slightly less constructed, "Losing control of a situation I've planned for." "Does that happen often?" "Less than it used to." He turned to look at her. "What does that have to do with tonight?" "Nothing," she said. "I just wanted to know something real about you before I have to pretend in front of 100 people." She paused. "It helps. Knowing one real thing." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back out the window. "We're almost there," he said. She faced forward, but she was not even a little bit thinking about the gala anymore. The room was everything Marco had warned her about, and several things he hadn't. It was full of people who smiled with their mouths and watched with their eyes, and every single one of them tracked her entrance on Dante's arm with the professional attention of people who understood what it meant when a man like Dante Moretti walked in with a woman they hadn't seen before. She felt the weight of it like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades. She kept her chin up. The first test came from a woman named Claudia 50s, elegant, the kind of woman who had learned to weaponize pleasantness. She appeared at Elysia's elbow within 15 minutes and delivered compliments in the precise tone of someone running an audit. "So you're the one who finally caught Dante's attention," Claudia said. "How remarkable. He's very particular." "He is," Alicia agreed easily, pleasantly. "That's one of the things I admire about him." Claudia tilted her head. "And how long have you known each other? He's been so private, none of us even knew he was seeing someone." "Long enough," Alicia said. And then because she could feel Dante's presence at her back a foot away, and because something in her just decided to commit fully and not quite long enough. That's the thing about the right person. Time starts moving strangely. Claudia blinked. It was the shortest blink in history, but Alicia caught it. Score 1. Dante's hands settled at the small of her back. She did not flinch. She had promised herself she would not, and she didn't, but she felt it everywhere like a tuning fork against bone. He said in that even voice, "Claudia, excuse us." And he guided Alicia forward through a cluster of people until they were in a marginally quieter corner. His hand dropped. She missed it immediately and resented herself for it. That was well done, he said. I told you I was convincing. You did. He looked at her steadily. The right person. That was improvised. Was it too much? A beat. No, it was exactly right. She looked away, found something on the far side of the room to focus on. Then we're doing fine, she said, and let's keep moving. They moved, and the thing she had not planned for, the thing that no amount of preparation could have accounted for, was how natural it started to feel. Not at once, not in a flash. Gradually over the course of the evening, the small adjustments they made to each other, the way he positioned himself so she never had to manage a conversation alone, the way she found herself actually listening to him speak and not performing. Listening the way he noticed when her glass was empty, before she did the way she laughed once at something he said quietly enough that only she could hear, and it was real. The laugh was real. That frightened her more than anything else in the room. In the car on the way back, neither of them spoke for a long time. The city moved past the windows, and she looked at it and thought about what she was going to do with the information she had just collected about herself. He said, "You were good tonight." "We were good," she said, because it was honest. Another silence. "Then my mother called this afternoon. She wants to meet you." Alicia turned to look at him. "Your mother?" "She lives in the north. She's not involved in the business. She doesn't know the details of the arrangement. She believes it's real." He paused. "She's going to ask you questions that are harder than anything Claudia threw at you. She's going to ask about your family and your intentions and what you see in her son, and she's going to do it with complete sincerity, which is somehow worse than doing it with hostility." Alicia considered this. "When 2 weeks?" "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. Like the words surprised him slightly. She turned back to the window, watched the city, felt the warmth of the evening still faintly in her chest like an ember that had no business being there. 3 days after the gala, she found Marco in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, and he had the face of someone who had not slept and was doing a poor job of hiding it. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him and said simply, "What?" "Nothing. It's nothing." "Marco." He looked at her, and then he said something she was not prepared for. "Victor Falcone knows you're here." The coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean he knows I'm here?" "I mean someone told him. Someone in the organization, I don't know who, told him that the reason Dante paid off Enzo Romano's debt wasn't business. It was personal. It was you." Marco's voice was tight. "And Falcone, being Falcone, has drawn his own conclusions about what that means." "What conclusions?" "That you're something Dante cares about." Marco looked at her steadily. "And therefore something that could be used." The silence in the kitchen was complete. She set the cup down. She kept her hands very still because they wanted to do something else. "Does Dante know?" "He found out this morning. He's handling it." "Handling it how?" "I don't know the specifics. Allie." Marco leaned forward. His voice dropped. "I need you to understand something. When I agreed to set up that meeting, I thought it was simple. I thought this was clean. But Falcone knowing about you, that changes the shape of this. That means you're not just a name on an agreement anymore. You're a variable, and in this world, variables get moved around." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this and not him?" "Because Dante will handle it and tell you only what he thinks you need to know. Because you deserve to know what you're actually in." He held her gaze. "Because you're my best friend, and I should have said some of this before you agreed, and I didn't, and I'm sorry." She absorbed that, sat with it, said, "Is he going to come after my father?" "Not if Dante moves faster." Marco straightened. "And he's very good at moving faster." She nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee. Her hands were completely steady. She was proud of them for that. What she did not tell Marco was what she was actually feeling, which was not only fear. It was also something she had no good name for, a kind of sharpening, a clarification, like the moment before a storm when the air changes and everything gets very clear and very immediate. She was frightened. And underneath the fear, tucked against it like a letter inside an envelope, was something that felt uncomfortably like the decision to stop pretending that what was happening in this house was only a transaction. She went to find Dante. He was in the study. The door was almost closed. She knocked and pushed it open, and he was on the phone, and he looked up when she came in and something passed across his face, not surprise exactly, but recognition. Like he had been expecting her to come, and he was noting that she had arrived earlier than he thought. He said into the phone, "I'll call you back." He hung up. He looked at her. "You should have told me," she said. He held her gaze. He didn't apologize. He said, "I was going to tell you this evening when I had more information." Marco told me. A brief something crossed his face. Marco should have let me handle it. Maybe, but he didn't, and now I know. She stepped further into the room. "So tell me the rest. Don't manage it. Don't give me the version you think I can handle. Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he said, "Falcone knows your name. He knows you're living here. He doesn't know the terms of our arrangement, but he's made an inference, and that inference is going to make him do something." He paused. "I don't know yet what. I'm finding out. Is my father safe?" "For now, yes." "Is he going to stay safe?" A beat that lasted slightly too long. "I'm working on it." She crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she was holding herself together while she thought. "You pulled me into this to solve a political problem. I pulled myself in to save my father. And now Falcone has taken notice of both of those things and turned them into a threat." She looked at him directly. "I need to know honestly whether your being involved makes my father safer or more dangerous." It was the right question. She could see from his face that it was the right question. She could also see that he was not entirely comfortable with the answer. "More complicated," he said finally. "Not necessarily more dangerous, but more complicated." She held his gaze. "I need that to change." "I know." Something shifted in his expression, something quieter and less constructed. "I am aware of what I asked you into, Alicia. I didn't anticipate Falcone moving this fast, but that does not mean I'm not. It does not mean your father is a secondary consideration." She looked at him. She believed him. She was not entirely sure she should believe him, but she did. And she filed that away under the growing category of things she was going to have to make sense of. Shannon. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. She turned to go. His voice came behind her, quiet, "Alicia." She turned. "I would have told you," he said. "Tonight, I want you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know," and she meant it. And that too was something new. She walked back down the hall to her room and she closed the door, and she stood in the middle of the space that still didn't feel like hers, and she thought about all the ways a simple transaction could become something else entirely. How the terms shift, how the definitions blur, how you agree to one thing and find yourself standing inside a completely different thing before you've had time to notice the walls going up. She thought about the way his hand had felt at the small of her back. She thought about the way he had said, "I am aware of what I asked you into," and the particular weight of the word aware, and the fact that she had believed him, not because she was naive, but because she was a good reader of people, and she had been reading him quietly constantly since the moment she walked into his study 4 days ago. She thought about Victor Falcone and what it meant that he knew her name now. She thought about her father in that house on the other side of the city, sleeping in blissful ignorance. And she thought about what Marco had said, that she was a variable now, that variables get moved around. She had spent her whole life refusing to be moved. She was not going to start now. She called her father that night. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been sitting with his phone in his hand, which meant he was scared, which meant the situation was exactly as fragile as she had feared. "Alicia," his voice cracked slightly on her name. "I'm fine, Papa. I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "Are you, how is it where you are?" She chose every word with care. "It's fine. It's a big house. I'm managing." "I don't like this," he said quietly. "I don't like you doing this because of me." She closed her eyes. "You don't know what I'm doing." "I know enough." His voice dropped lower. "Marco's brother is not a simple man, Alicia. I've heard things, Papa." She kept her voice even. "I need you to stay home. Don't go anywhere you don't have to go. Don't talk to anyone but you don't trust. And if anyone contacts you, anyone at all, asking about me, about Dante, about anything, you call me immediately. Not later. Immediately." Silence. Then, "What's happening?" Nothing, I'm being careful, that's all. She softened her voice slightly. Get some sleep. I'll come see you next week. She hung up before he could ask more questions. She sat in the quiet of her room and breathed and told herself that keeping him calm was the most useful thing she could do, and that panic traveled through phone lines like electricity, and she could not afford to send any down that wire. Then she opened her laptop and worked on her thesis for 2 hours because the one thing that had always worked when the world was sliding was to press her hands against something solid. Words on a page, argument and evidence, things that held their shape. She fell asleep at her desk and woke up at 3 in the morning and with her neck aching and a message on her phone from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words, no punctuation. We know where he lives. She was in Dante's room in under 2 minutes. She knocked twice hard. She heard movement immediately. He was either a light sleeper or he hadn't been sleeping. The door opened. He was in a dark shirt and his hair was slightly different, and his eyes were completely alert the way she was beginning to understand they always were, as if some part of him never fully went offline. She held up the phone. He read the message. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did something tighten, went cold and operational. Come inside, he said. She went in. He was already on his own phone moving across the room. She heard him give an address, her father's address, and say, 2 men outside tonight, immediately. He hung up, called again, said someone has Enzo Romano's home address. Find out who gave it to them and how fast. He hung up. He turned to look at her. Your father is going to have protection outside his house within 20 minutes. She nodded. Her hands were completely still. Inside, something was shaking. She was not going to let it reach the surface. This is Falcone. Yes. This is him telling us that the arrangement changes things. Yes. Dante set his phone down. He looked at her with that focused stillness. Are you all right? I'm fine. You came to my room at 3 in the morning. You don't have to perform fine right now. That landed somewhere unexpected. She looked at him, said more honestly, I'm scared, but I'm not going to fall apart. So there's not much point in saying more than that. He held her gaze. Something in his face shifted, not the cold, operational thing, something warmer and quieter. Sit down, he said, not the command version. The different version. The one that sounded almost like something was being offered. She sat on the edge of the chair by the window. He sat across from her. The room was very quiet. Tell me about Falcone, she said. Not the version you'd tell someone you were managing. The real version. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Victor Falcone is 71 years old and he has spent 50 years building a machine that runs on fear and debt. He's not impulsive. He doesn't do things like this. He gestured toward her phone. Without a strategy behind it. This message isn't a threat. It's a test. A test of what? Of how I respond. His voice was completely steady. He wants to see whether I move defensively, whether I pull back, whether the existence of someone I care about makes me smaller or larger. She noticed the phrase, someone I care about. She did not comment on it. She filed it. And how are you going to respond, she said. By making it clear, he said that the answer is larger. She looked at him for a long moment. The 3 a.m. quality of the room, the quiet, the lack of performance, the absence of any audience made everything feel slightly more unguarded than usual. She said, were you always like this? Like what? This certain, this calibrated. He considered it. No, he said, and the simplicity of it surprised her. No qualification, no elaboration. Just no, like something he'd made peace with. What changed, she said. I learned that uncertainty is expensive, he said, and I couldn't afford it. She wanted to ask more. She wanted to sit in this room at 3 in the morning and pull back the edges of him like pages in a book she'd been waiting to read. She didn't. She stood up. Thank you, she said, for the men outside his house. Go sleep, he said. I'll wake you if anything changes. She walked to the door, stopped, turned around. Dante, what you said that you're going to respond by going larger, what does that mean specifically? He looked at her, a long pause. It means, he said, that tomorrow I'm going to call a meeting that Victor Falcone will hear about before it's finished. And he's going to understand that touching your father is not a negotiating tool. It is the last thing he will ever do with his hands. The quiet conviction in that sentence made something move through her that she had no category for. She went back to her room. She did not sleep. The meeting he'd spoken of happened the next afternoon, and she knew about it only because she heard voices in the downstairs corridor, more people than usual, heavier footsteps. The clipboard professional tone of men discussing things that did not get written down. She stayed in her room until it was over. When Marco came up to check on her, she said, "Is it done?" And he said, "It's done." And she said, and he said, "And Falcone's people have already called twice." "What does that mean?" "It means," Marco said, leaning in the doorway, "that Dante hit something sensitive, and Falcone is recalibrating." She absorbed that. "Is that good, Bud?" "It's good in the way that backing a wolf into a corner is good. You've stopped it from moving forward. But now it has nowhere to go except through you." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The meeting with Dante's mother was in 4 days. She had almost forgotten about it, and then she remembered and felt the particular stress of it land on top of all the other stress like one more piece of luggage on an already strained rack. Dante's mother, Renata, was a woman Marco had described as warm but perceptive. The kind of woman who had lived long enough inside a complicated world to have developed an extraordinary sensitivity to what was real and what was performance. "She's going to know," Alicia told Marco 2 nights before. "She's going to take one look at me and know." "She's going to take one look at the way you look at him," Marco said, "and know something is real, even if the rest isn't." She stopped. "What is that supposed to mean?" He looked at her with the expression of someone who loves you too much to lie. "Allie, don't." "I'm just saying, Marco." Her voice was firm. "Don't." He held up his hands. "Okay, I'm just saying she's observant. Be yourself. That'll be enough." She thought about that later, be yourself, and wondered which self he meant. The self that was controlled and careful and capable. Or the self that had shown up at Dante's door at 3 in the morning with a shaking phone and stayed in his room for 20 minutes talking about certainty and cost and had not wanted to leave. She went to Dante the morning before the visit. She found him in the kitchen, which surprised her. She had never seen him in the kitchen, and there was something disorienting about it, like finding a portrait that had stepped out of its frame. He was drinking coffee and reading something on his phone, and he looked up when she came in. "She's going to ask about the proposal, Aita," Alicia said without preamble. "How it happened, when you knew, the details." He set his phone down. "I know. We need a version, a consistent one." "I know. So tell me what you want it to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The truth is that Marco has talked about you for years. I met you properly at his family dinner 18 months ago. I asked Marco about you a month later. We began talking carefully because I don't move fast with things that matter. And 3 months ago, I asked you to be with me, and you said yes." He paused. "That's clean. It's consistent with things people may actually remember or have observed, and it requires the least invention." She thought about it. "Why did it take you so long to ask between the dinner and 3 months ago?" "Because I wasn't sure I had the right to ask," he said. And the way he said it, quiet, factual, without any attempt to make it sound noble, made her breath catch slightly. She looked at him. "That's a good answer." "It's the true one," he said. And before she could examine that too carefully, he picked up his phone again, and the moment closed like a door, and she was left standing in the kitchen, wondering how many things he had said to her that were truer than she'd been ready to hear. Renata Moretti arrived like a warm front. She was 63 and elegant, and she had Dante's eyes and a face that smiled more freely, and she pulled Alicia into a hug within 30 seconds of meeting her that was so genuine it nearly undid her. She smelled like gardenias. She held both of Alicia's hands and looked at her face and said, "Oh, he did well," with a satisfaction so unguarded that Alicia felt immediately and completely guilty. Lunch was the 4 of them, Renata, Dante, Marco, Alicia, and Renata did exactly what Marco had predicted. She asked questions. Not interrogation, the worst kind. The kind wrapped in warmth and interest that made it impossible to be defensive without seeming hostile. She asked about Alicia's thesis and genuinely wanted to know. And Alicia talked about Renaissance portraiture for 15 minutes and felt herself relax into the conversation in a way she hadn't expected. And then Renata set down her glass and looked at her son and said mildly, "You look different." Dante looked up. "Different how?" "I don't know exactly. Lighter, maybe?" Renata tilted her head. Is that the word? He held his mother's gaze for a moment. Something passed between them, the language of people who know each other completely and communicate in frequencies no one else can hear. Then he said, maybe. Renata looked at Alicia. Whatever you're doing, she said simply and warmly, keep doing it. Alicia smiled. She looked at the table. She did not look at Dante. She was afraid of what she would find if she did. After Renata left after the car pulled away and the house settled back into its usual quiet, Alicia was standing in the hallway when Dante appeared beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, she liked you. She's very easy to like. She's not actually. She is very warm and she is very difficult to fool. He paused. She liked you because you were real with her. I wasn't performing, Alicia said. I liked her. That wasn't the arrangement. He looked at her. Something about his expression in that moment was different from every other expression she had cataloged on him. It was open was the word, fractionally carefully open, like a window someone had barely lifted. Neither was this, he said quietly. She looked at him. The hallway was very still. Neither was what, she said carefully. He looked at her for a long moment, and then his phone rang. He held her gaze for one second that lasted a very long time, and then he answered it. His expression closed. His voice went flat and operational. He said, when? He listened. His jaw tightened. He said, say that again. She watched his face. She had learned in the weeks she'd been in this house to read his face the way you learn to read weather. And what she saw now made her stomach drop. He hung up. He looked at her. His voice was completely steady. Your father is not at his house. She went very still. What do you mean he's not there? My men arrived this morning and the house was empty. His car is gone. His phone goes to voicemail. A pause that was barely a pause. There are signs that someone else was there first. The floor tilted. She grabbed the edge of the wall. They took him. I don't know that yet. Dante. Her voice was not shaking. She would not let it shake. They took him. Falcone took him. Say it. He looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that was close to pain. Then yes, most likely yes. She pushed off the wall. She was already moving. Then we need to find him. He was in front of her, blocking the hallway. Not roughly, just present. Solid. Alicia, move. Listen to me. His voice was low and controlled, and she felt it stop her the way a hand on the shoulder stops you. I need you to hear me right now. Not panic. Hear me. Falcone took him as leverage. That means he does not want to hurt him. He wants to use him, which means your father is alive, and he is going to stay alive as long as I don't do anything reckless. He held her gaze. Which means you cannot do anything reckless either. Do you understand? She looked up at him. Her face was completely composed. Her hands were completely still. But her eyes, she could feel her eyes doing something she couldn't control. Find him, she said. The quietest version of those two words. The most absolute. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. He said, I will. And then without calculation, without the choreography of their public life, without any of the arrangement between them, he put his hand against her face. Just that. His palm against her jaw, his thumb brushing the edge of her cheekbone. Brief, unperformed, more real than anything that had happened between them in weeks. He dropped his hand. He stepped back. He said in his operational voice, Marco, get everyone in the main room now. And he was already moving past her, already in motion. Already. The other thing, the controlled, strategic, dangerous thing that was also somehow the same man who had touched her face like she was something worth being careful with. She stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. She counted them. Then she followed him. Because variables get moved around, Marco had said, and she had told herself she was not going to start being moved. She was right. She was not going to be moved. She was going to move. And if Victor Falcone thought that taking Enzo Romano would make Dante Moretti retreat, he had made the most expensive miscalculation of his long and terrible career. Because what he had actually done, what he could not have known, was give Alicia Romano a reason to stop pretending that she was only here for a transaction. She walked into that room with her chin up and her hands steady and her eyes clear, And she stood next to Dante at the head of the table, and not one person in that room, not Marco, not any of the men who had spent years watching Dante operate, doubted for a single second that she belonged there. Dante looked at her briefly before he started speaking. Just a glance. But she knew what it held, and she let him see that she knew. Then he began, and the room went very quiet, and for the first time since she had walked into his study 3 weeks ago, with her father's catastrophe in her hands and her heart in her throat, Alessia Romano stopped thinking of herself as someone who had been brought into this world. She started thinking of herself as someone who was in it. The plan took shape over the next 6 hours in a way that Alicia found both terrifying and clarifying. She stayed in the room. Nobody asked her to leave, and she did not offer to go. And after the first 20 minutes, it became clear that her presence was simply accepted. Not because anyone had decided to accept it, but because she had made herself so fundamentally part of the landscape of the situation that removing her would have required an effort no one wanted to spend. She listened. She asked one question in the first hour, a logistical one about the timeline of when her father's phone had last shown activity, and the man who answered her did so without hesitation, which told her something about how the room had already recalibrated around her. Dante moved through the meeting with a precision that she had not seen before, not even at the gala, not even in the study. This was different. This was the thing he actually was stripped of every social layer, and she had no comfortable word for what it was. It was not frightening in the way she would have expected. It was the opposite of frightening. It was the most competent thing she had ever been in the same room with, and underneath her fear for her father, underneath everything there was something in her that responded to competence the way a compass responds to north. She hated herself slightly for that. She accepted it anyway. By early evening, they had 3 possible locations where Falcone's people might be holding her father. Dante's network had produced names, addresses, patterns of movement. There was a warehouse on the south side that had come up twice in intelligence from different sources. There was a secondary property registered to a Falcone associate in the Eastern District. And there was a third option, a legitimate business, a restaurant that Falcone's family had owned for 30 years, with a basement that had been the subject of rumors for longer than that. Dante sent teams to watch all 3. He sent his best man to the restaurant. He said nothing to Alicia about which one he expected, but she watched his face when the restaurant came up, and she filed what she saw. When the room cleared, when it was just the 2 of them and Marco at the table, she said, "It's the restaurant." Dante looked at her. Marco looked at her. He would put someone he considers a bargaining chip somewhere he controls completely, she said, somewhere with a legitimate surface. He's been in this business 50 years. He's not going to hold my father in a warehouse where any patrol car could raise questions. He's going to put him somewhere comfortable enough to keep him calm and contained enough to keep him useful. She paused. The restaurant, that's where he is. Marco looked at Dante. Dante looked at Alicia. Something moved in his expression, quiet and specific. "Yes," he said, "I think so too." "Then why are we watching the other 2? "Because Falcone is also 50 years experienced," Dante said, "and he will have considered that we might reach this conclusion. So I need the other 2 confirmed empty before I move on the one I'm certain of. If I move wrong, if I walk into a position he's prepared for, your father becomes a liability instead of leverage, and the math changes." His voice was steady and merciless. "I cannot move until I know." She understood. She hated it, and she understood it. "How long?" "Tonight, by midnight." She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 7:43, 4 hours and 17 minutes. She got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee because she needed to do something with her hands and with her body, because sitting still had become an impossibility. Marco followed her. "You doing okay?" he said. "Stop asking me that. I'm going to keep asking until you give me an honest answer." She turned and looked at him, her oldest friend, the person who had been in her life so long she sometimes forgot to see him. She said, "I'm holding it together because falling apart is not useful. But Marco, if something happens to him, it won't. You don't know that. Dante has never lost someone he committed to protecting." Marco said it simply factually, like a weather report. "I've watched him a long time. He takes on fewer things than most people in his position, but what he takes on, he doesn't lose." She thought about what Dante had said the night before about going larger, about Falcone miscalculating. She thought about the way he had touched her face quickly privately, something that had no audience and no strategic purpose. And she thought about what that meant. What it meant when a man who calculated everything did something that appeared to be uncalculated. Marco, she said, from the beginning, did he know? Did he know who I was before I came to him? Marco was very still for a moment. Too still. It lasted exactly one beat too long. What do you mean, he said. You know exactly what I mean. She kept her voice level. The political problem, the need for a fiancé. He said it had been an issue for 6 months. My father's debt that came up in the last 2 weeks. Those two things meeting the way they did. She looked at him. Marco, was it a coincidence? Another pause. Shorter this time. He ran his hand over his face. Allie, tell me the truth, right now, not the version you think I can handle. He lowered his hand, looked at her, and then he said quietly, he knew about your father's debt before you came to him. He knew because he found out because someone in Falcone's circle flagged Enzo Romano's name, and it crossed Dante's desk, and he... Marco, stop it. Started again. He had the information for 10 days before you called me. She heard this. She processed it. She set her coffee cup down very carefully. He was waiting for me to come to him. I don't know if it was that deliberate. He had 10 days and he didn't reach out directly, and he didn't route it through you, and he waited. Her voice was completely controlled. He was waiting to see if I would come. He set the terms before I arrived. He already knew what he was going to offer. Marco said nothing, which was its own answer. She stood there with her hands flat on the counter and breathed through the thing that was moving through her, not betrayal at his account, because she had not been lied to technically. He had never said this was random. He had never said she had found him. He had simply allowed her to believe the architecture of the situation was accidental, when in fact it had been what engineered anticipated. She didn't have the right word, and the absence of the right word made it worse. Did you know, she said. Not at first. Marco's voice was miserable. I found out 2 days after you moved in. And you didn't tell me? No. She looked up at him. There was nothing to say to that. That wasn't too large for this kitchen, this moment 4 hours before midnight. She picked up her coffee. She said, go tell him I need to see him. Allie. Marco, a single word. Final. He went. She waited in the kitchen. She heard footsteps. She heard the specific weight and pace of them, and she knew before he appeared in the doorway that it was him. Dante stopped when he saw her face. He was good at reading faces, she knew that about him, and whatever he read on hers in that moment made him very still. You knew about my father, she said, before I came to you. He didn't try to reframe it. He didn't reach for a technicality. He said yes. She had expected denial or qualification, and its absence hit her differently than she was ready for. For 10 days, she said. Yes. And you let me believe I had found you. I did not engineer your father's debt, he said. I did not create the situation. I saw it and I waited, and I had an arrangement in mind if you came. But I did not force you to come. I did not contact you. I did not pull you toward anything. Everything you chose, you chose. She looked at him. He was right. She knew he was right. It didn't make the shape of it feel better. You were calculating, she said, before I ever walked in. Yes, he held her gaze. I was. I'm not going to apologize for it. What I will tell you is that the calculation changed. She went very still. What does that mean? It means that what I was weighing, he stopped. Something moved across his face, something effortful, like a man who has spent a lifetime being precise, trying to find the exact right word, and finding that precision is failing him. What I was planning for and what has actually happened are not the same thing. What is between us now is not what I was calculating for. I want you to know that. She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. She was 23 years old, and she had been careful her whole life. And she was standing in a mafia boss's kitchen, being told that his calculations had surprised him, and that this was the closest thing to a confession she was likely to get from this man. And the worst part, the most complicated, most infuriating part, was that she believed him. When this is over, she said carefully, when my father is home and this whole thing is done, I need us to talk about what's real and what started as strategy. Properly. without an audience and without a crisis. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. I know. Okay, she said, and she looked at him for one more second. Now go get my father back. He left. She stood in the kitchen and felt the full weight of everything, the fear and the anger and the thing underneath both of them that she was not going to name tonight, not with 4 hours left until midnight and her father in a restaurant basement on the other side of the city. The confirmation came at 11:19. The other two locations were empty. Dante's man outside the restaurant had visual confirmation movement at the basement entrance, a schedule of guard rotations. Her father's description matched someone seen being walked between two men 4 hours earlier who had not appeared frightened, which meant he was alive and mobile. Alicia was in the corridor when Dante came to tell her. He stood in front of her and said, "He's there, he's alive. We go in an hour." She breathed out, one slow release. "Then I'm coming." "No, on Dante. No, not harsh, absolute. You being there helps nothing and risks everything. If something goes wrong, if Falcone's people see you, if you become a variable in the situation, then your father becomes more complicated to retrieve, not less. I need you here. I need to know where you are and that you are safe, because that is one fewer thing I have to manage in a space where I cannot afford to manage extra things." She wanted to argue. She looked at his face and saw that this was not about controlling her. It was exactly what he said it was, mathematics. The mathematics of a man who could not afford to lose his focus. "Call me," she said, "the moment it's done." "Yes. Don't make me wait longer than necessary." "I won't." She looked at him. The 12 hours of this day settled between them, the fear and the discovery and the kitchen conversation and the thing he had said about the calculation changing. She said, "Come back." He held her gaze. 2 words back to her, quiet and complete, "I will." He left. The house rearranged itself around his absence, quieter, heavier. Marco stayed with her. They sat in the main room and did not talk much. Marco put on something low on the television, and neither of them watched it. She kept her phone in her hand. She kept her breathing steady. 12:17, 12:41, 1:03. At 1:19, her phone rang. She picked it up before the first ring finished. Dante's voice, immediate, no preamble. "He's out, he's safe, he's with us." She pressed her free hand flat against her knee. "Is he hurt?" "Shaken, a bruise on his wrist where they restrained him." "Nothing serious. He's asking for you." She exhaled, the full exhale, the one she had been holding for 6 hours. "Bring him here," she said. "We're on our way." She looked at Marco. She said, "He's safe." And Marco closed his eyes, and she saw his lips move in something that might have been a prayer, and she understood completely. Her father arrived at 2 in the morning looking 10 years older than the last time she'd seen him, and 5 years younger with relief. He came through the door and he saw her, and his face did something complicated, guilt and love and exhaustion and gratitude all arriving at once. She crossed the room and held him, and he held her back, and she felt him shaking slightly, and she didn't say anything because sometimes the thing you need is not words. After a moment, he pulled back. He looked at her. Then he looked past her at Dante, who was standing at a slight distance with his jacket gone and his sleeves rolled up and something that was not quite tiredness, but was close to it around his eyes. Her father said to Dante, "You brought her into this." Dante didn't flinch. "No," he said. "She came to me. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." Dante's voice was quiet. "She made a choice. Every step of it was a choice. And she made every one of them clear-eyed and on her own terms." He paused. "I am aware that what surrounds me is dangerous. I am also aware that your daughter is the least fragile person I have encountered in a long time. I think you may have underestimated her for years." Her father was silent. He looked at Alicia. She met his gaze steadily and let him see all of it. The clarity, the calm, the absolute refusal to be presented as a victim. He looked back at Dante, and something in his face slowly shifted. "She should go home," he said, "when this is finished. Whatever arrangement, Papa." Alicia's voice was gentle, final. "I'll decide where I go." Her father looked at her. She saw the exact moment he understood that something had changed in her, not because of the danger, not because of the fear, but because of everything she had discovered in these weeks about who she was when she stopped managing a small, careful life and started living inside something larger. He didn't have the language for it, but he saw it. He nodded. Okay, he said quietly. She moved him to the guest room. She made sure he had water and something to eat, and she sat with him until his breathing slowed and deepened, and she knew he was finally genuinely sleeping. She came out of the room at 3 in the morning and found Dante in the corridor, just standing there, not waiting exactly, just present, the way he sometimes was in the particular quiet of the house's late hours. She stopped when she saw him. They looked at each other. Thank you, she said. He said nothing. He was looking at her with that open, fractional expression she had seen before, the one that appeared only in the unguarded moments, the 3 a.m. moments, the kitchen moments, the one that was not performed. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to tell me the truth. Yes, he said. Not yes, I'll tell you the truth, just yes, like he already knew the question. Did it matter to you, she said, before tonight, before it became about getting him back? Did it actually matter me here, this outside of what it solved for you? He looked at her for a long moment. The corridor was very still. Yes, he said. Since when? Another pause. Something that might have been the beginning of discomfort, the kind that comes not from being caught, but from being seen. Since before you came to the study, I told you Marco has talked about you for years. I told you that it was because your name was recognizable. That wasn't the complete truth. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something that she had given up trying to control. What was the complete truth? That I had been listening, he said, for years to Marco describe a woman who was careful and brilliant and completely unimpressed by things that impress most people. And I had been, he stopped, looked for the word. Curious, I had been curious, which is not something I experience often. And when your father's situation appeared, I did not create it. But I did not ignore it either, because I thought, he stopped again. What did you think, she said. His voice dropped slightly. I thought if she comes to me, I'll know she's not afraid of hard things. I thought if she comes to me, I'll know she's someone I can, a pause, then quietly without decoration, someone I can actually trust. She looked at him. The full weight of that settled into her. She said, that is the most complicated way a person has ever told me they wanted to get to know me. Something moved in his face, something she had not seen before, something almost improbably like amusement, warm and real and very brief. She felt it in her chest like a struck bell. I know, he said. I don't recommend the method. She laughed, a short, slightly undone sound that surprised even her. And he looked at her when she laughed the way he had at dinner that first night, and she understood now what that look meant. She had a name for it now. She just wasn't sure she was ready to say the name. We need to deal with Falcone, she said. Coming back, being practical, because one of them had to be. Yes, he said, back to the other register, but not all the way. Something of the previous moment stayed in his face. Tomorrow. Is it finished tonight, what happened? No, he said. Tonight was retrieval. What comes next is resolution. Falcone crossed a line. That requires a response that ensures it doesn't happen again. And what does that look like? He considered. It looks like a conversation, he said. The kind where terms are set and the consequences of breaking them are made so clear that the other party never doubts them. She thought about how that conversation might actually go, what it required, what it cost the world she had been living inside for 3 weeks. That was not her world and was increasingly not entirely not hers either. I want to be there, she said. He looked at her. Alicia, not in the room. I'm not asking to be in the room. She held his gaze. But I want to be in the house when it happens. I want to know in real time, not after. And I want you to tell me what was said. She paused. I'm in this, Dante. You made me part of this when you left Falcone, no doubt about who I am to you. I'm not going to sit in a room upstairs and wait politely anymore. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him considering not whether she was capable. She understood he had already resolved that question, but what it meant to say yes, what it restructured. Yes, he said. She nodded. Good. She turned toward her room, stopped, looked back. Dante. He met her eyes. What you said earlier, that the calculation changed. She held his gaze. Mine did too. She went into her room. She closed the door. She stood in the dark and pressed her hands against her face and felt the whole shape of the night. The fear and the relief and the anger and the revelation and the thing she had just said to him, which was the truest thing she had said to anyone in a very long time. She was not in this arrangement anymore. She was in something else. Something with no clean name and no exit clause written into it and no predetermined end date. Something that had started as a transaction and had become by increments, by late nights, in unguarded moments, in the specific education of watching someone be exactly who they are under real pressure. Something she would not have chosen in advance and could not imagine walking away from now. Victor Falcone had made a mistake taking her father. But the larger mistake, the one that would define how this story ended, was that he had given Dante Moretti a reason to reveal himself. And in revealing himself, he had given Alicia Romano the one thing no careful life ever had, something worth being reckless for. Morning arrived the way it does after a night like that. Not gently, not with any particular mercy, but with the flat insistence of a world that does not pause for people who haven't slept. Alicia was up before 6. She had not gone to bed in any meaningful sense. She had lain down. She had closed her eyes. She had listened to the house settle around her and thought about everything she had said and everything she had heard and everything she had decided. And at some point, the thinking had become something close to sleep, and then it was morning. She checked on her father first. He was still sleeping deeply with the particular abandoned quality of someone whose body had finally collected on a debt of exhaustion. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him and felt the complicated love she had always felt for him, the love that had never been simple, that had always come braided with frustration and worry, and the specific grief of watching someone you love be smaller than their best self. She let herself feel it fully. Then she closed the door and went to find coffee. Dante was already in the kitchen. They looked at each other across the room. There was a different quality to the morning after everything, a different texture to the air between them, like a room after a storm. Something had moved through and rearranged the furniture, and now they were both standing in it, taking stock. He poured her a coffee without asking, pushed it across the counter. She took it. "How is he?" Dante said. "Still sleeping." "Good." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "When is the meeting with the Falcone?" "This afternoon, 3 o'clock. He looked at her steadily. "I meant what I said. You can be here, but I need you to stay in this part of the house." "I know," she paused. "What are you going to say to him?" Dante was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to remind him," he said carefully, "of certain realities he appears to have forgotten. About what I control, about what I can reach, about the precise and specific consequences of any further contact with anyone connected to me, by name, by proximity, by association." His voice was even and complete. "And I'm going to make sure that when he leaves, he understands that last night was the last move he gets." She held his gaze. "Is that enough words?" "The right words said by the right person in the right room, yes." He looked at her without looking away. "He is 71 years old and he has survived this long by knowing which fights he cannot win. I'm going to make the math very clear." She believed him. She also understood that the word words was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and that the full content of what would happen in that room this afternoon was something she was not entitled to every detail of, and she had made her peace with that. Not because she was being managed, because she understood the architecture of what he was. "Okay," she said. He studied her. "You're not going to argue." "No. You argued about everything else. I argued about the things I had standing to argue about." She met his eyes. "This one is yours. I trust you to handle it." Something in his face, quiet, significant of the needle of that inner compass, settling again. He said, "That's the first time you've said that." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I mean it." He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then Marco appeared in the doorway with the specific energy of someone who has read a room and is choosing to walk into it anyway, and the moment shifted but did not disappear. It stepped back, folded itself into the space between them, where it had been accumulating for weeks. "He's awake," Marco said. "Your dad. He's asking for both of you." "Both of you?" Alicia noticed that. She saw from Dante's face that he noticed too. Her father was sitting up when they came in, and he looked at them, at Alicia first, Then at Dante, then at the two of them together with the eyes of a man who had spent a night in a basement with a great deal of time to think and had arrived at some conclusions he was not entirely comfortable with, but had decided to stop fighting. He said to Dante, "Last night those men, they told me things. About you. About what you are." He paused. "I spent a long time in that room thinking about whether I should be more afraid of them or of you." And, Dante said, "And I decided it was the wrong question." Her father looked at his hands. "The right question was whether my daughter is safe and whether whoever she is with in whatever world she's in, whether she made the choice herself." He looked up at Elysia. "Did you, Yes, Papa," she said quietly, completely. Every step. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Dante. And then he said something Elysia had not expected. "Not in this sequence and not on this morning. She's the best thing I ever did. And I know I didn't do enough to deserve her. So," he stopped, cleared his throat, looked directly at Dante with the dignity of a man who had very little leverage but was spending what he had. "You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," Dante said, "I do." "Good." Her father nodded once. "Good." Elysia felt something shift in her chest, warm and aching, and too large for the morning. She reached over and covered her father's hand with hers, and he turned his palm up and held on, and she let him, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that was not already in the room. Dante left them alone. She stayed with her father for another hour, not talking about anything important, talking about her thesis and his neighbor's cat in a television program he had been watching and couldn't find the finale of. Normal things, the kind of conversation that is itself a form of recovery, a declaration that the ordinary world still exists and is worth returning to. When she finally came out, Marco was waiting in the hallway. He looked at her with a question in his face. "We're okay," she said. "He and I are okay." Marco exhaled. "And you and Dante?" She looked at him, her oldest friend, who had put all of this in motion in ways he hadn't fully understood, and who had been living with the guilt of that for weeks. She said, "Why didn't you tell me he'd been asking about me?" Marco blinked. "What?" "You said he'd been listening for years. Marco, you talk to me every week. You've been talking to me and talking to him for years, and apparently the information was flowing in directions I didn't know about." She kept her voice even. "Why didn't you tell me he was paying attention?" Marco was quiet for a long moment. Then carefully, "Because I didn't know what it was. I noticed that when I mentioned you something in him, he got very still, very focused, the way he gets when something matters to him." He paused. "I didn't know if it was protective or something else. I didn't want to say anything that would..." He stopped. "That would make you feel watched, or like a target." "Instead, I felt like a transaction," she said. "I know." He looked genuinely miserable. "Allie, I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sighed. "Stop apologizing. You were trying to protect me the only way you know how. And it backfired slightly, and we're all still here." She reached over and pressed his arm once. "We're even, but next time there is something you think I might want to know about the man you've decided to involve me with, tell me." "Deal," he said. "Absolutely. Without question." A beat. "There's not going to be a next time because I am never doing anything like this again." This was a Marco. "Yes, deal." She almost smiled. "Go find something useful to do." He went. She stood in the hallway and breathed, and then she went to her room and sat at her desk and opened her thesis and stared at it for 30 seconds before she accepted that she was not going to write anything today and closed the laptop. At 2:45, a car arrived. She heard it. She heard the front door. She heard voices. Dante's another she didn't recognize, and then a third that was older and smoother and had the particular quality of someone who was accustomed to rooms changing their temperature when he entered. Victor Falcone. She stayed where Dante had asked her to stay. She sat in the main room with her hands folded and her back straight, and she listened to the muffled sound of a conversation happening behind a closed door at the far end of the house. She could not hear words. She heard tone. She heard Falcone's voice, that smooth, measured quality, for the first several minutes. Then she heard Dante's, and then for a very long stretch, she heard only Dante's. And there was something in the way the dynamic of sound shifted, the older voice going quieter, then quieter still, while the younger voice remained exactly as even as it had started, that told her without words everything she needed to know about how the room had moved. Marco appeared in the doorway. He said nothing. He sat down across from her. They waited together. At 3:41, she heard the front door again. A car. Departure. Dante came in 4 minutes later. He looked the same as he had, going in shirt, no tie, that particular composure. But something around his eyes was slightly different, resolved, like a calculation that had reached its final line. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me." He sat down. He said, "Falcone is going to release any claim on your father's history, permanently. He is going to retract from any connection to the Romano name. And he is going to make it known in the appropriate circles that Alicia Romano is not a variable. She is not leverage. She is not a name anyone in his network touches." He paused. "In exchange, I've made certain commitments about territory and about what I won't pursue in the next 18 months. It cost me something. It was worth it." She held his gaze. "You gave up territory for my father." "Yeah." "For you," he said, simply, directly, without flinching. She sat with that, the full weight of it. She said, "Dante, I don't want you to say anything about it right now," he said. "I didn't do it to create a debt. I did it because it was the correct response to the situation and because—" He stopped. Then he looked at her with that open, unguarded expression. "And because the shape of this has changed. You said that last night. I'm confirming it from my side." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The arrangement, the original terms." "Yes. 3 months, possibly 4. Yes. We're at 3 weeks. She held his gaze. "What happens to the arrangement now?" He was quiet, in that specific thinking way, not avoiding the question, but taking it seriously, treating it the way he treated everything that mattered. Then he said, "I think the arrangement ended some time ago. What's here now is something else. The question is whether you want it." She looked at him, the man who had calculated her arrival and been surprised by what came after. The man who had touched her face at 3 in the morning with no audience and no reason except that she needed it. The man who had given up 18 months of territorial leverage for a name on a list of people who were safe. She thought about the girl who had kept her world small because she had learned that small was survivable. She thought about what it had cost her, not in suffering, but in living, in the particular hunger that comes from standing always at the edge of things and never walking in. She had walked in. She had walked into this house and this world and this complicated, unscripted thing, and she had not broken. She had not been moved. She had moved. "I want it," she said, something in his face, the full exhale of a man who does not exhale easily. "I should tell you something," he said. "There are going to be people who have opinions about this, about you in this world. It will not be simple. There will be events and pressures and moments where you will want to be somewhere quiet with your books and your thesis and your ordered, manageable life, and you will not be able to go immediately. That is the truth of it." "I know," she said. "I am not an easy person," he said. "I am precise and I am demanding, and I have habits that are not Dante." She looked at him. "I grew up watching my father be a disaster, and I am currently writing a thesis on a period of art history that most people find impenetrable, and I negotiated a deal with a Mafia boss at 9 in the morning on 4 hours of sleep. I am not looking for easy." He looked at her, that thing in his face that was almost improbably amusement, warm and real and entirely his. "No," he said. "You're not." She held his gaze. "I want the real thing, not the arrangement version, not the public version, the actual thing, whatever it is with its actual terms and its actual complications. I'm not interested in anything else." He stood up. She stood up. They were a foot apart, which was closer than they had been in private without the specific context of a crisis, and she was aware of every inch of that foot. He said, "My mother called this morning, before the meeting." She blinked. "What?" "She called because she had been thinking about yesterday about meeting you, and she wanted to tell me something." He paused. She said, "Don't let that one go." Alicia felt something move through her from the chest outward. "She said that?" "She has never said anything like that. In my entire adult life, she has never, he stopped, looked slightly undone, which was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen on his face. She is not a woman who overstates things. Neither are you, Alicia said. No, he said. I'm not. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then she said, Des, so don't. He closed the foot between them. His hand came up to her face the way it had in the hallway the night before, the same careful, deliberate gesture, the same palm against her jaw, but this time not brief and not for comfort. This time it was a statement. She put her hand over his and held it there. He kissed her. Not the performance version, not the gala version, not anything shaped for an audience. Something private and real and unhurried, the kind of kiss that arrives not at the beginning of something, but at the moment when two people finally stop arguing with the thing that was already there. When they stepped back, she was breathing slightly differently than she had been. He was too, though he would never admit it. She looked at him and felt the full and complicated truth of who he was, not simplified, not softened, not without edges, and she did not want it simplified. She wanted exactly this, the weight of it, the realness. My thesis defense is in 6 weeks, she said. He looked at her. I know. I need to actually finish it. I know. And my father needs to go home soon. He cannot live here. He'll drive your entire operation into the ground just by being charming at inconvenient moments. The almost amusement again. I'll arrange a car for him tomorrow. And she stopped, looked at him directly. I need to know that when I say something matters to me, you tell me the truth. Even when the truth is complicated. No more letting me believe the architecture of something is accidental when it isn't. He held her gaze. A long moment. Then, yes, that is a fair requirement. And in exchange, she said, I will tell you when I'm frightened, instead of performing fine. Something in his face went very still and very warm. Yes, he said, I would prefer that. She nodded. Then we're clear. We're clear, he said. Marco appeared in the doorway. He looked at the two of them at the distance between them that was different from every other distance, at whatever was on both their faces, and he put his hand over his mouth and turned around and walked back down the hallway without saying a single word. She would hear him 20 seconds later, saying to no one in particular, but loudly enough to carry, finally, absolutely finally. Dante looked at the doorway, then he looked at Alicia, and for the first time since she had known him, the almost amusement became actual amusement, real unguarded belonging only to this room and this moment. She laughed. He smiled. And in that exchange, small, private, unmistakable, something sealed itself shut on the version of this that had been a transaction, and opened wide on the version that was the truth. Her father left 2 days later, better rested and better fed, and with the slightly dazed quality of a man who had gone to sleep in one version of his daughter's life and woken up in another. He hugged her for a long time in the front hallway. He shook Dante's hand formally, seriously, with the grip of a man making a promise he intended to keep. He did not say anything large. He said, call me when you get a chance. He meant it simply. She understood it completely. She watched the car go. She stood in the doorway and felt the quiet that followed, and found to her own mild surprise that it was not an empty quiet. It was full of what was in the house behind her. Marco in the kitchen starting an argument with the coffee maker, her thesis open on the desk in her room, with 6 weeks of good work left to do, and Dante somewhere in the study, handling the ongoing mathematics of his world, a world that was now also partially hers. Not because she had surrendered to it, not because she had been pulled into it against her nature, because she had chosen it with the same clear eyes she brought to everything, the same careful intelligence she had spent 23 years developing, and because she had looked at this man complicated and precise and occasionally infuriating and entirely real, and decided that the calculus of her own heart was a form of evidence she was going to trust. She went back inside. She went to the study. The door was open. She knocked anyway because she had always knocked, and she was not going to stop just because things had changed. He looked up. She came in. She sat across from him. I have 6 weeks until my defense, she said. I know. I'm going to need quiet mornings. You can have them. And I'm going to need you to stop scheduling things before 10 without checking with me first. He looked at her steadily. That is a significant operational adjustment. I'm a significant adjustment, she said. Across Across the board. You knew that going in. He held her gaze for a moment, then he said, yes, I did. She opened her bag and took out her notebook. He looked back at his papers. They sat in the same room in the particular comfortable quiet of two people who have nothing left to prove to each other. No performance, no management, no careful architecture of impression. Just the work of two real lives in the same space going forward together. Outside the window, the city moved through its Tuesday morning. Inside, Alicia Romano, who had kept her world small because she had believed that was the price of safety, and who had learned in 3 weeks that the price of safety was not smallness, but courage, turned to the first page of the chapter she had been avoiding for a month and began to write. Dante Moretti had spent 34 years building a life that ran on control and calculation and the deliberate management of every variable within his reach. He had built it carefully at significant cost, and he had believed that the structure of it was complete. He had been wrong, and for the first time in his life, being wrong had given him something no amount of calculation could have produced. They had both walked into a transaction. They walked out the other side of something no contract could contain, no arrangement could name, and no ending date could survive, because what had grown between them was not the result of proximity or circumstance or the manufactured closeness of a shared lie. It was the result of two people who were exactly who they were under real pressure in unguarded moments, choosing each other anyway. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, because it was true. And the truth of it was larger than every careful wall either of them had ever built, larger and stronger and built to last.